Hey, hello everybody. I'm More Gravity. Let's review a really great game of chess. My opponent and I finished this game of chess about 10 minutes ago. And I'm going to take you through pretty much step by step the action that occurred on the board. King's pawn opening. I've been trying recently c5 in this situation and just dealing with the fact that I might lose my e5 pawn. I deal with it sometimes like with queen e7. But I've decided, that's not tournament ready. So I'll play to the main lines with knight c6. Roy Lopez, exchange variation, all this is well-known book. And so I break from book here. This is a pin that is often very useful. It helps black control the center by both, in some ways, limiting the queen's movement, white's queen's movement, as well as very extremely limiting the knight on f3's movement. A little bit of a edge in mobility as a result of that move. Of course, everything has its cost. This cost me the pawn on e5, which, like I said earlier, sometimes I'm not all that worried about losing that pawn, especially if it's in the early going. Queen swap on d1 is the best move, most certainly. And with the king recapturing, I choose to both castle and develop my a8 rook to d8, check to his majesty, and lo and behold, the knight on f3 is still pinned. Still pinned thereafter as probably the best move here for white. King e2 keeps the pin intact, but wisely allows the h1 rook to enter the fray with perhaps rook to d1. I'm looking at this with black to move as mostly an opening portion of the game. The opening portion of the game, black has shown his mettle. It's a black victory in the early going here. So time to get down to long-range plans. G6 is hatched out of the idea that the pawn on e5 is a target. We think of pieces for white that might be able to defend that pawn. When we find nothing on the d file, we find a pawn on the f file that's blocked by the pinned piece. The pinned piece is seemingly protecting e5, but of course not, because he's pinned to his king. And the knight on b1 could travel to c3, where it's kind of at odds with being able to protect e5. Whenever you see a knight let's take this example. My knight on g8 here, and then the square e6, where these are along the same diagonal but include one square in between them, e6 and g8 include the diagonal are the diagonal, and it includes the square at f7 in between. This knight is not getting to e6 anytime soon, just by way of how the piece movement ends up working, or in this case, not working well, and not working for black, right? And now we're finally, with all those arrows going which way and every way, which way and back, we are finally in a position where on the next move, black can move to e6. This one diagonal with this on the diagonal with one piece in between. Pretty much for most of your calculations, just think of it as that's my knight, but he's not going there. H3 actually kind of surprised me a bit. Stockfish marks this as an error, and I think by way of the game, so we'll move forward. Bishop takes f3, and it's a little bit of a different board now. Well, frankly, now the pawn on e5 is looking even that much more delectable, is looking that much weaker. And my opponent was probably wise to capture back with the pawn on g2. So g2 captures f3, and the king on e2 stays where he is, or else is maybe a little bit overexposed were he to capture on f3. So my opponent captured wisely here. Bishop to g7, just aiming at this e5 pawn. If I recall, and by way of how the board looks, is going to fall probably right now. And bishop takes e5. And just a bit of criticism here. We know my opponent and I both played very accurately. I to 87%, my opponent to 78%. But that being said, I don't understand in this position with white to move, the move c3. What exactly does white plan to do with c3? And if anything, we'll play c4 and then build a strong pawn chain. And allow our knight more luxury of where to move after the move c4. The knight can move more freely to c3 here, as it can also move to d2 in some circumstances, except for that the bishop is a little bit hemmed in. Yeah, c3. I'm very critical of this move. I don't see how this helps. Maybe another suggestion my suggestions would be c4 or bishop to f4, protecting the pawn on e5, although it's going to fall anyway. So then maybe wisest is pawn to f4, protecting e5 more strongly so. And, from there, white has probably found a moderate advantage, a moderate edge in this position. c3 is just not that good. So bishop takes e5. It's the best move. We're going to grab that material. Material is now even. Overall, I'd say this is just pretty darn near an even chessboard. These doubled pawns on the f file might be a little bit weaker than black's doubled pawns on the c file by way of pawn to b6, pawn to c5, and we've got this nice healthy way for pawns to look and be that helps protect them from frontal attacks along the c file. We can even throw a5 in there. This is a really strong nexus of pawns on the dark squares around black's king after castling on black's queen side, or on the queen side. Just after black castled on the queen side. Knight e7, simply developing. Now's the time to develop that knight. Maybe knight f6 was possible, but mostly I'm looking to develop the knight before it's too late. I have to one of the opening goals is development. So knight e7 does that at least well enough. I have a strong pawn chain after the move pawn f7 to f5. Black enjoys an advantage in space in this position. Black definitely has somewhat of an advantage in space. We can see this being more relevant maybe on the next move, where black could threaten white's dark squared bishop with the move pawn to f4. And the bishop has few places to which he can find refuge in that case, and we'll see this something similar to that comes to fruition, shows up, bears its ugly head. No, not ugly head, but bears its head in the forthcoming moves. White plays rook d1 in order to challenge the file. I thought this was the right move in that position, and black will keep the tension along the d file and plays b6 with the aim of simply controlling white's knight. Right, so the knight is tenuously controlled from aggressive maneuvers on black's side of the board. Half of the board. b6 is very good at controlling the a5 square. Also gets at this strong structure, c7, b6, and then back to the c file, c5. It also gets to that structure without any wrongdoing along the way. I don't know, but yeah, my opponent captures on d8, and I was happy to see that during the game. But for what reason was the d file ceded? I don't know. It looks like my opponent feels comfortable. Let's say my opponent feels comfortable with the minor piece play that results after trading off rooks. And I can understand that. So rooks are traded. Here we have that strong structure. c7, b6, and c5 with the potential of pawn to a5 being also part of this structure. Knight to d2. Probably looking for a good outpost, hoping I'll trade on e4 and then he can recapture with the knight on e4. I'm not going to let a strong knight like that enter onto my board. Not at no man's land, not nowhere. So I let the tension remain, where if he wants to make his own path towards e4, he, she, or they has to initiate an attack with e4 takes f5, and then g6 takes f5 in return, keeps control of the e4 square, or at least strong contesting of the e4 square in black's hands. Bishop to f4. Bishop to f4 might be an attempt for white to escape the threat that I'm about to levy against him on by way of g5 and then f4. But I'm not sure. I guess this is the point where that breaks. If white could move his knight somewhere, perhaps to c4 seems decent. Maybe even b3, and then bishop can at least skirt back to c1 or d2. And Stockfish suggests the move bishop h6, and there the bishop should be relatively safe. Moves like g5 to try to keep the bishop in place and then march either the king over don't work. So the king moves into a wall of his own pawns, and all the black squares that would allow us to enter this square are covered by the very same bishop that white is trying to save. Let's look at the knight on c6 could move to e7, and it still looks like maybe it's difficult to get at the h6 bishop. A little better than with the king because of knight to g8 eventually, and we're attacking h6 with the knight. We can get at the h6 square due to the nature and fact that knights alternate the color of squares that they attack and occupy. Let's take a look at that. Dark square, light square, dark square, light square, dark square, light square, dark square, light square, right? So the knight must always alternate the color square from where he is to a different color square when he lands. Dark square on b8, dark square on a7. You get the idea. All right. So, but all that aside, we're kind of backpedaling a bit here to back to the game. So anyway, we were at Regina's, and I played the move pawn to g5. This is a strong move, forcing white's bishop back, and then closing things off with f4. I had some hesitance to this because normally with same colored bishops, as black, I would most likely want to place my pawns on light colored squares. In most circumstances, the pawns go on light colored squares, so that my bishop may remain mobile and that my opponent should pawns lock in some way with his pawns on dark colored squares, right? Then I have those pawns as targets. They may not be assailable right now, right this very minute, but while they are on dark colored squares, I may attack those pawns because, of course, the bishop starts on the colored square where he'll remain for the rest of the game. That's true of all bishops. And so I would normally want to keep the f5 pawn on f5 and maybe trade it off if there's an issue. But here I took a little bit of a risk in playing f4. It's not the move that you think of first, because do you really hem in white's dark squared bishop all that well enough to alter your square color strategy? And here I thought so that I did. It turned out I was right, so that's why I won, and that's why I'm reviewing this game. I only review my wins, by the way. If anyone, any of my viewers are new, I don't review losses. Sometimes, I think on rare occasion, I'll review a draw. All right, so I'm pursuing this partial light square strategy right now for black. Place pawn on c4 while the knight is protecting. Added pressure means either exchanges or added support. I think I chose added support. Nope. Yes. This was a key moment in the game. If black's knight's gonna get active on white's side of the board, he's got to do it now, pretty much. This tenuous, and I say tenuous, so extremely tenuous hold on the d3 square is lended by a sacrifice by the warrior on c4. All right? This pawn is giving up his life for my knight to make it to d3. And I know that Stockfish doesn't like this move, but it's an excellent one. The pawn goes away on c4. One way or the other, I'm still going to be capturing a pawn on f2 and probably another hereafter on h3 if it scoots forward. I've got enough firepower to capture it there, and so we have that maneuver. Now this is maybe a little bit of a miss here. It looks like it could have trapped the knight. Let's see, knight to e1 check. Okay. Bummer. Yeah, no, I played a bad move here. It looks like knight to e1 check gathers the f3 pawn quite directly. And I went even more direct than that to capture on f2. But, people make mistakes. I was glad still to see h4 with g5 takes h4 a possibility. But first I'm going to continue along the long-term strategy of hemming in white's dark squared bishop. With the move knight to g3, the bishop is now cut off a bit from the action. Notice if black captures on g3, the recapture will probably put, if white captures on g3, the recapture will put black in a good position to threaten for pawn promotion. And this is now this is just a one end game. Bishop at e7 is going to move to g5. And remember I said that e5 pawn was weak? Well, guess what? Its weakness belies the ending of this chess game. Right? As e5 falls, white's position is no longer tenable. We've got extreme decoy on the king side, and king to e2 shows that white now has no option. White now has no option but to cede the bishop on e1. In some way, shape, or form, that bishop is going to be lost. We'll just play that out. Right, so bishop takes, and here the best move is king takes f4, because taking the bishop just leads my f-pawn along this golden path to promotion. Not to worry. What should we do? Go over here and let the distraction on the king side be enough. So having the extra piece means long range attacks favor black, and it's just rinse and repeat. All right, so that's it pretty much. Thank you all for watching. I'm More Gravity. Have a great night.